to do a deep dive on the topic, we are privileged to be joined by a pair of leading experts. Please join us. Give a big round of applause to Safi Ehsan Rizvi. He is the IPS Advisor, Mitigation National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA, and also Ashish Chaturvedi, the Head, Action for Climate and Environment, United Nations Development Program, the UNDP India. Welcome, sir, on stage. And also, I would like to invite Nitesh Mehrotra, the Partner Sustainability and ESG by India, on stage to moderate this session.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. And with that, Nitesh, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you to my esteemed panelists for the time. Some of you may know we did a study, and one of the aspects we wrote in the report, and as you know, I think from an India growth story, known stats, last year, our per capita GDP was per capita income, right? It was about $2,500 roughly, and our study shows, EY study shows that we will grow 6x, and we will get to about FY47, where we get to 100 years, about $15,000. And I think there lies a very important bit, that as India's growth trajectory grows to multiple X, whatever that X could be, obviously a lot is being said that we are lowest per capita carbon consumption, and Ashish, I'll start with that segue. How do we see our carbon trajectory growing, right? Right now, obviously, it's very low, but with this increase in economics, right? And we all know economic growth and carbon are very inextricably linked, right? They all go together. So how does India see its carbon pathway from that perspective, from a growth perspective?
Thanks. Nitesh. No, it's an interesting question, and let me start by saying I'm delighted to be here. Lots of empty chairs, but of course, quality matters much more than quantity. So
a lot of online viewers.
No, all right, excellent. So delighted to be here. I think interesting question. If you had asked this question, say 15 years ago, I think the answer would have been obvious, right? That as you grow, you would actually emit a lot more. The Indian experience over the last 10 years clearly suggests that that's not the case. India has already been able to decouple its emissions with its growth pattern, right? So we've kind of, this relative emission intensity of GDP. India is able to kind of bend the curve already by reducing around 35 to 45% of its emission intensity while it is growing, right? So, and I think as you grow further, there are very many sort of opportunities. So those of you who've been here since the morning would know that there are enough and more technologies which are low carbon. Renewable energy is just one sort of prime example, but the entire transition to electric vehicles, the transition from sort of more high emission agriculture to climate resilient agriculture, there are many pathways for decoupling emissions from growth. And I think this is what the government of India has already been kind of talking about, has been pushing, that we try and as much decouple the emission pathways with the sort of growth patterns. Having said that, India is a growing country. It's expanding. The GDP, as you said, would expand maybe 6x times. And that's why the net zero pathway that we are adopting has a certain timeline which is not necessarily aligned with the other developed countries. Yeah. And for good reason, because a lot of the emissions that have happened thus far have been sort of emitted by the developed countries. So India has that leeway to actually take a slightly longer term view on this. And that's why the government of India's sort of current ambition to go net zero by 2070. That might change, but so we don't need to guess today. But I think 2070 is still far away. But the fact that you're actually taking a little bit longer to go down to net zero is also reflective of the development realities which has happened over the last 150 years.
Right. No, absolutely. I think it's still very aspirational for India in many sense, given our growth trajectory. So Ashish, just double-clicking on that a little bit, as you're saying, maybe we are already bending the curve, right? Some of the data is showing, which is great, a lot of effort on decarbonization is happening on the industrial and other side. But some people may argue that from an agriculture-related emissions, right? Because we are primarily an agri-economy. I think some stats were thrown that 55% of the emissions in India are related to agri in some sense or the other. We all know intensive fertilizers, the energy that they use. Do you think a lot's being done on the mitigation from an ag standpoint in the country, or is there is enough focus?
Well, let me just, the official government of India position on this, on agriculture emissions is pretty well known in the policy space. A large part of the Indian farmer community is still marginal. They have land holdings of less than 2 hectares. So these are emissions of requirement and necessity. These are not luxury emissions. There was a very famous paper written in the late 80s about luxury emissions versus necessity emissions. So Indian agricultural emissions are largely driven by necessity of smallholder farmers. And therefore, India doesn't really talk India has pushed back very strongly on agricultural emissions since the very beginning of the UNFCCC negotiations, and India still holds that stand. Having said that, I think the government is doing a lot of very proactive programs on climate resilient agriculture. For instance, one of the missions of the National Action Plan on Climate Change focuses on sustainable agriculture, the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture. We have the NICRA program, National Initiative for Climate Resilient Agriculture. And of course, now there are lots of other agriculture and allied emissions sectors like mangroves, like fisheries, like animal husbandry and dairy, where there are significant initiatives which are looking again to bend the curve. So two parts to two-pronged response to your question. One, agricultural emissions are not traditionally the focus of India's climate policy because these are emissions of necessity. Having said that, India's doing quite a bit already. And I think, of course, more can be done. And I think this program, like we've just started a program on climate resilient agriculture with the Ministry of Agriculture as well. But I think we need to keep that nuance in mind.
Right. No, thank you, Ashish. Thanks for that perspective. So, Safi, shifting to you a little bit and shifting gears to a little bit on adaptation, right? Some would argue adaptation is more important to the country, disaster management, and I think Ashish talked about resilience. So maybe some view in terms of what the government is doing, what the thought process is at the moment on how adaptation measures are being looked at, and what are some of the initiatives that are being driven at the moment?
So it's great that you mentioned disasters as well. I didn't see disaster written at any one of those nice blocks over there. This is a very important impact of climate change. And India is seeing disasters in its highest ferocity. 2 sessions ago, you saw Dr. Ravi Chandran, the Secretary of Ministry of Earth Science. He mentioned how the Arctic ice change was impacting the Indian monsoon, especially the August-September part of it, and how the heavy rains in India were impacting the Arctic ice. And there is 20 years of study on this, which we are doing in Norway. So if you look at the rains that happened in Delhi today, so there were 235 millimeters in just 3 hours. So 235 millimeters, as per the IMD statistics, in 3 hours is a lot of rain, because the average for Delhi is known to be 600 mm. And all of that came in 3 hours.
Right.
So the term that was used by us in our local parlance is FDI. The frequency, the duration, and the intensity of these extreme events is changing.
It's a new FDI term we should add, because I know we've been used to some other FDI definition.
Exactly. So this too is the FDI of the disaster management community, of the climate adaptation community. And if you see what Dr. Ravi Chandran had said, the impact of rising seas, the impact of rise in sea surface temperature. So in 2023, sea surface temperature was the highest all through the year, compared to 1850s and 1860s.
Right.
And 2024 has not been left far behind. So if your sea surface temperature is rising, there will be more clouds, there will be more precipitation on land, there will be stronger cyclones, and you are seeing things like, things that have not been actually decided that this is the reason for climate change, or what is the reason for this. There is a certain set of scientists who feel that monsoon is also changing in its duration and intensity. He also mentioned a very good number that the amount of rainfall for the entire country in monsoon has not changed.
Right.
However, the frequency
And the intensity,
duration,
the drought,
intensity
it's
is
a very
changing.
important nuance.
So this is the impact which we need to really talk about. Its impact on agriculture, on livelihood. You might start having a lot of extra rain in Rajasthan and Gujarat, and it might reduce in Assam and Uttarakhand and Himachal.
Yeah.
So these can have trends which can be really far-reaching. So a government is looking at these things in a very close way. The Ministry of Agriculture, the National Disaster Management Authority, there are various ministries, and a little piece comes out of every ministry. So NDMA comes from the disaster side, the Ministry of Environment comes from the climate side.
Yeah.
So all these groups combine and they work at things. So that's to initially say, and if you think there is time, I can talk about glacial lakes also.
Yeah.
That's also another very interesting thing that is coming up, especially in India. It is really bothersome. There are 7,500 glacial lakes in India.
Yeah.
The entire Indian Himalayan region has 28,000. The NRSC, ISRO has mapped them all out. These 7,500, there are about 200 that are high risk. So the government of India is looking at them very closely in a very coordinated fashion. We are moving towards mitigation. In disaster lingo, mitigation means risk reduction, which is similar to what climate adaptation means in the
Right,
climate lingo.
right.
So risk reduction of the lake is that if you try and lower the level of the lake by draining it out in advance rather than having it burst out when there's too much water in it, these kind of measures are being tried. We are sending up 35 to 40 expeditions this year to these high-risk lakes. So a lot of efforts are being done on all kinds of hazards. This is just one example.
No, that's great. That's great to know that there is coordinated response, data-led response, science-led, as you said. But if I were to click on it a little bit to say that, is there enough real-time alerts for people, right? For the citizens, wherever they could be, right? And as you said, data, science, I know ISRO, we were talking, is doing a lot of stuff. Could you talk a little bit about how this could be enhanced? How could we get more real-time alerts so that we can have a little bit of a proactive response as much as possible? Some of it we have to react, that is very, very clear. But is there a bit on it, and how can data and technology help?
So that's a very valid question, and this is, unfortunately, it is not very well known, but there was a mention in the 2 sessions before about the cyclone in Odisha in 1999. It was a super cyclone. It caused a lot of damage to life and property.
Yeah.
Immediately, the Indian Meteorological Department, IMD, and several other agencies got together, and over a period of time, they have built a system where for every single cyclone, when it starts off as a depression, like the recent cyclone Rimal started off as a depression off the coast of Chennai. And it was a depression, not very strong, but they were tracking it.
Right.
And then when the cyclone formed and it reached their supercomputer told them that this is now moving into a cyclone, they gave you a 7-day track. In 7 days, they gave you an advance warning that this is the line that the cyclone will follow. So that is the extent to which early warning has reached on that that's one single hazard of cyclones. So there is a lot to do. Because there are several more hazards and there are several more hazards for which things have been developed. But the point about citizens. So there is something that NDMA has been working on and started, and it works successfully, is called the Common Alert Protocol. So it comes as an SMS on your phone. However, this will come only before the disaster. After the disaster, if your telecom communications go down, then there is a problem. So that is also what we are working on now.
Right.
And the cap is a pretty big thing. So if the cyclone is coming in this track, it's going to go through these 3 tehsils of Odisha.
Yeah.
So all those people currently in those 3 tehsils in Odisha will get that SMS. It won't go to anybody else.
Yeah.
Then just today, the minister inaugurated something called NDEM 5.0. So the National Disaster Emergency Management Protocol, it's a platform which is available to every individual. And it gives you all the possible alerts that are there. It's got GIS maps for every hazard.
Yeah.
It's really well done.
Yeah.
So that must be taken a look at. And the amount of open material that India's scientific agencies have put out, it is amazing. And many people don't know about it. As again was mentioned, I mean, I'm a government guy and I'm so proud of the fact that this NDM portal, if you look at it when you go back, you'll be surprised at the kind of technology that is being used to build these things.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's phenomenal. That's great to know. I didn't know some of it myself. Thank you for that. Ashish, turning back to you a little bit, I think you talked about net zero journey. India has 2070. Paris, we need to achieve a target. Some would say we are a little bit off, right? It's being discussed in COP every year. I think the new inventory also doesn't show very encouraging results. But coming to from an India standpoint, do you think we have a strong net zero pathway? How is that looking? And what other steps, in your view, we should be thinking about, and how can private sector also play a role in that?
Now, thanks for the question. I think it's very critical to start thinking about how do we sort of evaluate our journey to 2070?
Yeah.
Or how do you start looking at different pathways to 2070? The pathway to 2070 is not going to be linear, right? That, okay, we do incremental change from one year to the other because, well, carbon stocks are embedded in stocks of capital, right?
Yeah.
So you actually have a stock of building which is getting built now.
Yeah.
That carbon stock's going to remain for the next 75, 100 years.
Right.
Similarly for infrastructure that you're building now.
Yeah.
So what you're doing now in terms of infrastructure choices, in terms of any capital stock, any kind of capital investment has to be thought of in terms of low carbon,
Yeah.
but at the same time climate, well, sort of risk resilient, because as we've already seen today, but also in the past, that you can't have infrastructure which is creaking at the margins, new infrastructure which is creaking at the margins,
Yeah.
while it is being built. So you will basically not be able to, you will actually have a double whammy.
Yeah.
You will invest in new infrastructure, and then climate risk, physical risk like extreme weather events will destroy that infrastructure. So you will actually have more embedded carbon in newer infrastructure that you're going to create. And I think that's why you need to think about integrated approaches between low carbon and climate resilient or resilient infrastructure. The government of India, and I think Safi can talk more about it, has this coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure as well, which is active all over the world. But the idea that we've been thinking about adaptation and mitigation pretty much in silos. And I think one of my asks is to start thinking much more integrated approaches for adaptation and mitigation. Now, buildings is one example, but then there are many others. Agriculture is another example.
Right.
You can actually do very good climate resilient agriculture. System of rice intensification for growing paddy, which reduces water consumption, which reduces emissions, but it is much more resilient to the changing climate, and it's very good for mitigation as well. Similarly, solar cold storage for farmers. We've done sort of solar cold storage for 5,000 women farmers in Bihar, and that is both adaptation and mitigation. Mangroves. Growing mangroves in coastal areas is both adaptation and mitigation. It protects you against disasters, but it's a fantastic carbon sink as well. So you can monetize the reductions in carbon in adaptation projects as well, because there are co-benefits. I think as far as India is concerned, I think most assessments suggest that India is doing fairly well. Right?
Relative at least to other nations.
Relative,
for sure.
yeah. So you have to think about it in terms of the sort of global community.
Yeah.
India is doing fairly well as compared to the rest of the world, especially developed countries. And a big part of the issue that we haven't touched upon thus far is, well, sort of finance.
Yeah.
That's a big elephant in the room. If you want to raise ambition, well, the Paris Agreement has a structure. It expects developed countries to provide financing to developing countries, and that is not really happening. Now, what can India do so that it becomes a better destination for not that FDI, but other kinds of climate
We
finance?
need both FDIs,
Other kinds of climate finance is what the Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, and NITI are currently doing. So NITI Aayog's doing a sort of a big exercise on net zero pathways for India. We are also members of that working group. And we are actually looking at what kind of institutional innovation is required so that, and what kind of instruments, financial instruments are
Yeah.
required so that the inflow of climate finance becomes much more easier and much more. So I think that kind of preparedness is going to serve India much better, much well going in the future as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think a couple of points you touched, Ashish, which are, I think, very important. One is, obviously, as you say, and I think we always say, majority of the India is still to be built, right? If one would say 3/4 of the country is still to be built. So how do we build in a manner that it creates more opportunity rather than risk? Because then the point on double whammy, as you talked about, I think is very, very critical from that standpoint. I think finance, I know obviously the developing nations are crying, but obviously what it is, I think blended finance probably could be the answer to that. I think so that's very, very important, absolutely. So Safi, I might turn to you a little bit on financing side. I think still very relevant. And I think the other point, Ashish, as you said, and I'm hoping that's the link, right? Because we need to talk adaptation, mitigation, disaster management, resilience in an all integrated manner. Otherwise, obviously, our efforts and our response is not very cohesive. So maybe a little bit on financing, what you're seeing, what should we be doing, what is the government thought process?
See, one very big milestone event happened when the 15th Finance Commission recommended and the Government of India accepted its recommendations. There's an entire chapter on disaster risk reduction. So disaster risk reduction was allotted a fairly large amount of money. At that time, it was, I think, $30 billion over 5 years, of which $6 billion was for mitigation. So mitigation, as I said earlier, is basically risk reduction. So the thinking, the policy is on the absolutely right path. A fair bit of that amount was pre-allotted to the states, given to them every year, and there are guidelines for them to use that money. So a lot of things that were not done earlier, as in using nature-based solutions to resolve issues, like I mentioned, glacial lakes. So reduction of the level of the lake is taking away the incremental of that year from the melting glacier, and it's also reducing the lake. So you're avoiding water and you're also reducing water. So these kind of measures are all can come through these funds. So that finance from the state side, that's a fairly good piece. The other part is the same Finance Commission mentioned alternative means of finance. So they spoke of very, very focusedly, in a focused manner, they spoke of disaster risk insurance. So disaster risk insurance is not really like an LIC policy, but disaster risk insurance has now moved from the regular type indemnity-based insurance to parametric insurance. So a lot of people in the world, a lot of companies, a lot of state governments in India also are considering and are in discussions. Parametric insurance is trigger-based. So like in Delhi, if we had decided that we'll have 100 millimeter rain per day, if it crosses that, then an automatic payout will come to the government. So then an automatic payout would have come for today, which would have been distributed over the affected areas in whichever way the government or the insurer or the insured feels like doing. The other part of that can be catastrophe bonds. So just a few hours ago, there was an earthquake in Peru, 7.2 on the Richter scale. I don't know what the shake intensity was and what the contract is about. 3 months ago, they had an 8.0 earthquake. So they have a catastrophe bond in line with 3 other neighboring countries. I think it's run by the World Bank. So these 4 countries have got together, put out a 1.2 or a $1.5 billion catastrophe bond. And catastrophe bond, from the finance point of view, is a very interesting product. So why would any investor invest in a 1.5 billion product when he knows that if there's a disaster triggered by these parameters, I could lose my principal or a part of my principal? So the reason is very simple, that the people who are today taking the risk is governments, risk retention, risk transfer insurance company. There are 5, there are 10, there are 15 reinsurers. However, when you go to the international finance markets, you have people with very deep pockets who are just de-risking their portfolio. So the investment in the CAD bond may be 0.1% of their portfolio,
Overall portfolio,
and they don't mind losing some of it. So it's a high-risk endeavor, and they obviously get a higher coupon on it, which is almost equal to the premiums you would have paid if you would have taken a regular insurance. So there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah.
And there's a fair bit that public finance has already done.
Yeah, no, Sophia, I think these are great points. I think in insurance, I'll be honest, one is obviously from a public sector point of view, the private sector also needs to think as these disasters come, how they're protecting, mitigating. So absolutely. Sophie, just to hone in a little bit on the other point that you and I were talking earlier is on startups, right? I know startup movement is pretty big. You think startups are supporting this space? Are they picking up some of these initiatives? Are we innovating enough? And what's the sense? And what is government doing to further create awareness on such an important area that they can play an innovation role around adaptation and disaster management?
So startups are basically really much required in the field of disaster risk reduction. When you look at wherever there is technology, it is mostly in spaces where there are already people who have done a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of work has been done, and then there's another guy and there's another guy. And they find some kind of a revenue model, and then everybody runs after that one revenue model. However, if you look at areas where not much work has been done on the mitigation side yet, like my favorite subject of glacial lakes and landslides in the hills, there are possibly 11,000 susceptible areas. So who's monitoring them? There is a science called, it's not even a science, it's a very simple technology called interferometry, SAR interferometry. If you do interferometry by comparing two remote sensing images, you can check millimeter movement in slopes. Yeah. So that is very important for glacial lakes and very important for landslides. So, but I don't see any young organization in India or an old organization or a large foundation working on this. 11,000 landslide points, 7,500 glacial lakes, and not one person there. So just like the drones came into India, some bit private sector, some bit government, slowly everything came, then the Prime Minister took this entire initiative forward, he pushed it, came up with various kinds of good policies that brought things in. So the drone industry has built up. Similarly, the disaster risk mitigation industry focused on 2-3 tough hazards needs to build. And the startups can do it.
That's great. I think that's a great point to think. And I think we need to create more awareness because, as you said, the business model exists. We just need to maybe give them more use case, create an ecosystem and create that awareness to support. So that's great. Ashish, I know we have a few minutes left. Anything else that you want to touch that I didn't touch upon that you want to talk to the audience? So.
Sure. No, I think any kind of transition and that kind of transition that we're talking about, low carbon, climate resilient, has to keep people at its center.
Right.
So this human centricity of any large transition so that we are not leaving the most vulnerable and most marginal further behind has to be a critical element of this entire process. And I think this is what we have to keep in mind when we start thinking about policy making in areas like low carbon power systems. What happens to the coal mining areas? What happens to the people who've been working in the coal mining areas? So we are doing some work in Jharkhand with the Jharkhand state government on the just transition away from coal.
Yeah.
When you start thinking about people who are suffering because of extreme weather events like heat, so we are of course fortunate enough, we're talking about things, but people's lives and livelihoods are getting affected as today. So the human centricity, the people centricity of any policy, any program, any large initiative, any work on financing is critical. And I think that's something which should be at the heart of any large initiative or small for that matter, that how do we keep the most vulnerable, most marginal people on the top of our minds when we start thinking about prioritizing climate action. And I think that is going to be very critical. My second quick point is, I think the government of India is pushing, and the Prime Minister himself has talked about this lifestyle for environment. I think these two things are related. People who are at the margins already live lifestyles for environment. People who are not at the margins, people who are much more fortunate, have to learn lifestyles for environment. And I think this is where the rub of the the road is, that we basically need to work on policies which keep the margins, people who are at the margins at the center, but also give messages of lifestyles for environment to the more fortunate in this country, but also in the global north.
Yeah, no, that's a phenomenal point. And I think I always say, I think to reiterate your point that we need technology at speed, innovation at scale, but most importantly, humans at heart, which is the whole just transition cry, but probably not very understood, in many quarters. So that's a very, very important point. Safi, anything from your side that I didn't touch, you want to talk a little bit about what other government initiatives or anything else that we didn't touch in our conversation today?
No, there's nothing that you haven't touched upon, and you've taken two big subjects head on. One is climate and one is disaster. There is, most people feel a bit of an issue in figuring out where is the difference. So essentially, disaster is the effect of climate change. And for climate change, the way, as I mentioned earlier, how the monsoon can be changing, the forest fires in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, we saw a fair bit this time. And it is linked to the fact that they had a slightly dryish October to December. So the rains, that is the northeast monsoon, when it comes back in its second avatar, it brings rains there. It did not. And maybe in 2, 3, 4 years in the past, it still did not. So what will happen to the pine forests in Uttarakhand and Himachal? It's a large policy question. And or the next year, the monsoon might just change and go back to its normal style. So we need the scientist analysis, the research institutions to study this properly and get us that answer before we actually see the answer by ourselves. So the amount of hazard assessments that is needed, the amount of open source data that is available on, if you see in climate and disaster, there's a lot of material available on open source.
Right.
And the best material is, you cannot even Google it. You have to go to the right university, you have to know the right guy, that this guy works on it, Google his name, and then you will find the resources he has created, and it's all there on public, it's open to public use. So if private individuals, either foundations or scientific institutions, they work on this, pull out all that material, do their assessments, and come to us or any government agency, we are always there to help. I mean, this is something that is changing the way we operate. If the Finance Commission took such a big step by putting out $30 billion for 5 years, then you can imagine that the next Finance Commission will also be looking at this question. So these things are not just for government to do. It is for the rest of the world and the Indian private sector and the Indian philanthropic sector to jump right in, and this is the time.
Right. No, that's a phenomenal point. And I'll just to labor on it, I think it's a great use case for AI today, right? Because there's a lot of data out there. I think the challenge, as you said, is knowing the credible data, whether it's credible, because there's not of non-credible data also, and then getting to the right source and then modeling it with the right interpretation. But I think there is a great use case to really have a lot of intelligence that can be driven. So with that, I think we're over time. We will pause here and hand it back to the team back there. Yeah? Okay, thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. Thanks for your time. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all of our panelists for this rich discussion. And Nitesh, we ask that you please present our panelists with individual certificates that, of course, allow them to track the status of their trees real time in Chennai. So if you could please have the certificates on stage so that Nitesh can do the honors.
Big round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. A very engaging conversation, and of course being moderated by Nitesh.
And I want to mention that the EY team, of course, has put together a carefully curated white paper that is going to be available for download on our website.
Yes. Gentlemen, please continue to be with us on stage. And of course, Nitesh, in the same spirit, we also want to take this opportunity to present you with a personalized plantation certificate as well. Pooja, please do the honors.
All right, sure.
All right. For a quick photo op, please.